Hello, my name's Felix von Geyer. I'm a freelance sustainable development journalist and used to lecture energy policy at Concordia. I think when I used to speak to the White House policy framers on climate, Landon Van Dyke, who's now the US Green Star, he'd say, how do you actually kind of get like push and pull? So it's a case of like, what do you need to do to get market push for the market then to respond, to actually really address kind of clean energy? And I think three words which probably have come out here are the ideas of technology, ideas of conservation, ideas of investment. And we're talking about cap and trade, so probably for Ontario to pick up on hydro, they'll need to have a clean energy credit as well for actually importing hydro. Give me your thoughts on these ideas. Thank you.
Anyone? Mark?
Sure. I mean, I think the key driver seems to come down to putting a price on carbon somehow. Mm-hmm. How you do that is a matter in some cases of theological debate, but it seems we're moving in those directions. That's kind of the key market signal. I mean, a lot will flow from that. It's probably true, given experience in other dimensions of energy, that there may also be cases of market failure, and that other forms of policy intervention will be needed to support technological innovation and transitions. We know that's the case around energy efficiency, that even price signals alone are not going to get you where you need to get to. We've got the additional problem that we're going to be, whether we go with a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, we're also going to be in a period of price discovery to figure out what the carbon price we need to prompt the transition that we need on the types of timescales that we need them to happen on. If we're to avoid dangerous climate change, it's going to present a whole series of additional challenges. In terms of the Ontario-Quebec relationship and electricity, I mean, one of the ideas that, of course, Pierre and I have both floated around is of course, the possibility of a grand bargain between Ontario and Quebec. That Ontario's participation in the WCI, which involves some economic risk for Ontario, be bundled with a reasonable agreement around electricity imports from Quebec to Ontario as well. So there's a quid pro quo between the two provinces, that Quebec gets the partner that it would like in a carbon market, and Ontario gets access, perhaps goes a little closer to the front of the line in terms of access to what surpluses Quebec may be in a position to offer.
Quickly, if I may add, so you need to start with to have obviously a critical mass of participants into that market. You need to have the right level of credit allocation to start with, to not too wide, not too general, in order to start with price that reflect the true value of carbon. And then you need to have independent registry and accounting of all these measures, and make sure that all the sectors are committed to achieve that target. So.
I think to some extent there's in our society there's a reluctance to pay for the public good. So people claim they don't like to pay taxes in general, although we get a lot of benefits from good institutions and a good public service. So there's this lack of understanding.
Normand Mousseau. At one point, there was some reluctance from Hydro-Quebec, for example, to sign long-term contracts with Ontario, with the fear that Ontario would take this electricity and turns and sell it at a higher price to its neighbors because it's relatively well connected. I mean, are there ways to circumvent this or to ensure that the profits are distributed and to alleviate this fear?
Well, if I may, if Hydro-Quebec is happy with the price they receive, if the energy goes into supplying the native load or being exported in MISO or their jurisdiction, I mean, that's the prerogative of the buyer. And I think times have changed, and now in a surplus environment, I don't think that would be a consideration. But it should be clear up front what the destination of that power, obviously. Because if Hydro-Quebec is already active in MISO, they don't want to cannibalize sell that they already are making into surrounding jurisdiction. So you're right on that front. There's also a perception that that Hydro-Quebec has been fighting that they're really cheap supplier. I mean, I don't think they're a cheap supplier, they're quality supplier. And again, it's a segue to my statement that they should be, and we should be recognized for the true value we bring to a system in terms of reliability benefit and obviously reliability enhancement. So.
Monsieur Durani.
Bonjour. Hello, I will ask my question in English. We've seen a very, very strong price signal from the last wind RFP in Quebec at 6.3 cents a kilowatt hour. Ontario is moving now with his own RFP in September. And that price signal is consistent with what we've seen in Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan in previous RFP. So my question is, regarding Ontario, would you think the perception could change in Ontario when compared to nuclear costs, let's say, if the next RFP was to come at a price comparable to Quebec for wind?
Well, yes, that would have a very positive impact. The feed-in tariff for wind power now in Ontario is over 11 cents, and the critics say, well, that's too high. But if the price came in at 6.3 cents, which is the Quebec price, it was 6.3 cents plus 1.3 cents for transmission. If the Quebec wind comes in at 6.3 cents, which is lower cost than what even Ontario Power Generation says rebuilding Darlington will cost, well, then that would make a very, very powerful argument in favor of wind. But again, we would have to have the to really make it a viable option, would have to have the storage balancing service provided by Hydro-Quebec, because the nuclear people in Ontario always say, well, wind's not viable because it's intermittent. But in partnership with Quebec's reservoirs, we can turn wind from an intermittent source to a firm base load support. And so if wind comes in at 6.3 cents in Ontario, I mean, that will just change things profoundly.
The larger question in Ontario, though, is I mean, absolutely at that price, we're at grid parity. We're better than grid parity almost. The big question is how much more wind is Ontario going to be looking to acquire, given that we're in a surplus situation at the moment, and this is the big part of what makes the nuclear refurbishment decisions so central, is the extent to which there's any room left in Ontario's needs on the supply side. It rests on what happens with the refurbishment decisions. I mean, that's the extent to which Ontario would be interested in additional supply beyond sort of symbolic and small scale things with wind. It's completely a function of whether or not the decision to proceed with the refurbishments occurs or not.
If I may add, wind and solar, the cost of developing these resources have reduced significantly since the last 5 years. I would think about 30 to 40%. There's a lot of report and study to support that statement, one from Lazar actually that I have in mind. And now it's becoming more and more competitive, and definitely it has its places in the portfolio mix. In terms of balancing challenges, you need to plan at the same time to have some base load flexible generation to complement these intermittent resources. In Ontario, at the same time, they've increased aggressively intermittent resources, and while shutting down coal generation, that we're there to assume that role. And in terms of pricing, I agree that previous procurement round were expensive, but were reflecting these development costs at the time. The ongoing large renewable procurement initiative in Ontario is a competitive process. We should see more aggressive pricing, and there's a cap price per type of resources. So the landscape is definitely evolving toward more economical renewable resources to be added to the system.
Monsieur Deneau.
Hi, Michel Deneau from HEC. To come back to the long-term contract that was a main ingredient in Mr. Saint-Onge's presentation, and the point of the second last question. In terms of profitability for Hydro-Quebec, why is it obvious that a long-term contract will be better than just a sequence of short-term contracts? Is it obvious? Is there some studies behind that? Is there some main reasons why you want that instead of, as I say, just going day by day and having some periods where you're obviously making a lot of money by just going with the markets, and some periods where you're making less money than with a long-term contract?
Well, I think it's good for Hydro-Quebec because we're proposing to double the price you get. According to the Quebec Energy Commission, you're exporting lots of power at 3 cents a kilowatt hour on the spot market. We're suggesting a long-term price at double the price, 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So, you double your revenue, an extra $700 million a year. So that, to me, sounds like a great deal. And over 90% of Hydro-Quebec's exports are on the spot market. They're short-term sales. Surely that's not an appropriate portfolio. Surely you would desire to have more long-term contracts, one, because we're proposing a higher price, and one, to give you more stability of revenues. And also, if it's with Ontario, there's no foreign exchange risk. So it seems to me your portfolio is far from optimal. It's virtually all to the United States, and it's virtually all short-term, which can be very volatile and as you've seen in the last few years, the shale gas revolution, your revenues per kilowatt hour have dropped dramatically.
Yeah, the risk is at the moment, the risk of the short-term market is, that it's driven downwards, and we don't know how long natural gas prices are going to stay low. Because that's the trade-off there. That's the risk. If natural gas prices start to rise, then it might make sense to continue in the short term. So it's a form of hedging, if you like, against an increase in terms of what happens with the natural gas price. It does guarantee you a revenue stream and a stability that, as Jack says, is certainly doing better than the current spot market prices. So it's a risk and a trade-off, but it may be one worth taking. Particularly if Ontario can, as we've suggested, the flip side, of course, is another risk mitigation for Quebec, which is if Ontario participates in the carbon market, that's an attractive proposition for Quebec as a whole as well. So you put the two together, at least on the surface, it appears a somewhat attractive proposition relative to the current situation.
And if I can just add, the last long-term contract Quebec signed was with Vermont in 2010, a 26-year deal. The starting price at 5.8 cents. But there is a price adjustment clause. It's linked to regional prices in the U.S. Northeast. So if prices do rise in the U.S. Northeast, you'll get a higher price over time. Conversely, if prices fall, you'll get a lower price. So you've got a long-term contract, 5.8 cents, much better than 3 cents. Plus, there's upside potential if prices do rise, if electricity prices do rise in the U.S. Northeast, which would happen, presumably, if gas prices rise.
Okay. If I could add just one...
Go ahead, you turn to...
Okay, thank you. I'll be brief. I'll just speak generally about it. I think the decision to go short-term or long-term is best made by the board of directors or the investors of the companies wanting to invest in capacity, or the Brookfields board of directors, or the shareholders of Hydro-Quebec, which is the government. At some point in time, the surplus will no longer be a surplus, depending on where Quebec's energy demand goes, electricity demand. So to plan for future hydro dams, you're talking about a 10 to 20-year horizon. And Quebec society so far has assumed that you build for Quebecers and export the balance of the triangle until you reach that. But that could change. If you had, I will repeat my little thing, if you had externalities internalized in terms of the price and the carbon price in the commodity, it might be more acceptable to Quebecers to say Hydro-Quebec, or investors in Brookfields, to have Brookfields invest in production based on other short-term or long-term contracts, depending how they can maximize the value to the shareholder. So we can have a societal debate about what's best, what's not, but in the end is how do you achieve economic efficiency with short-term or long-term contracts, depending on how you analyze your net present value.
Thank you.
Did I steal your thunder there yet?
It's a good segue to the investment philosophy of Brookfield. And of course, we look at the long-term market. We buy an asset that we think will gain value, will be better recognized. As I mentioned, we believe that the hydro generation is not recognized fully for the benefit they provide. Eventually, in a reduction carbon era, we'll get there. We're patient, and we don't look on the screen and to just, oh, today we bought it obviously above market, and another day we're patient, and we know at one point we'll achieve the return that we want. Yeah. And so far, that paid off as a strategy. Just like to remind that just on the natural gas side, since 2000, we've seen 2 cycles of price of like over $12 for a certain period of time. So it's very cyclical, and that would, so people have a short-term memory. So obviously now prices are low, but they will come back. So you need to have a long-term conviction that what you're doing to hedge your exposure is the right strategy. And also, out of Quebec, I just want to mention that, yes, even if the spot price are very low, 3 cents, 4 cents, they're very sophisticated in terms of hedging the return. So there's financial tool, there's financial transmission rights, there's congestion rights. You can buy ahead to capture price in more lucrative market. So I would say that out of Quebec, net back price they're making is probably higher than 3 cents, but not 100, not 10 cents, obviously. Just a few thoughts on the wind PPAs in Quebec. I think there's 2 problems with all the called bashing against these contracts. I mean, we made a choice of society to develop wind generation in Quebec. It comes with a lot of benefits that are not fully accounted. Like in the US, all the Class 1 REX market right now, in Massachusetts, Connecticut, you're talking $55 per megawatt hour currently. That's only for the environmental benefit that the society enjoy from these stations. When you see the calculation about these contracts or purchase at loss, they compare with spot price in the US, which is not the right benchmark. You should look at procurement of these type of assets in the US on long-term contract. And 7.6, including transmission, it's getting pretty competitive, if you want my advice. So they are not dedicated to export. That power is dedicated to be consumed in Quebec as a choice society, and that's how we should see it.
Thank you. Yes.
Bonjour, Caroline Gélineau, Hydro-Québec. Justement, pour faire une petite rectification concernant les prix aux exportations, we're talking about an average price of 6 cents per kilowatt hour when we talk about exporting. So it's a very very good business for Hydro-Quebec. So it's more like average is 6 cents for 2014. Thank you.
If I may, now that I want to support your statement, yeah, but it's limited. I mean, quantities are limited, and I haven't dived into your last annual report that has been published this week. But obviously, the intertie are fully used. The surplus is massive. So there's either you need more intertie capacity to realize more sell, because I think now you have optimized what you can do in market, and you're still subject to the volatility, future volatility of the market. So these prices could go lower, it could go higher, who knows? But in terms of capturing what Hydro-Quebec production can capture, I think it's optimized right now. So
I'll follow up on I'll go to this question. Emmett, please.
Hello, my name is Emmett Stiff. I have a question. Mr. Winfield, you said earlier that when Ontario brought in all that wind generation, that the transmission system actually did a pretty good job of accommodating all that. So looking forward, I've heard a lot of concern about electric cars and the impact they're going to have on the grid, as well with technology, handheld phones, real-time pricing. That hasn't been talked about today. Maybe you can provide some insight in terms of if the wind energy addition was so good, how will the electric car rollout happen?
It's a good question. And it depends in some ways how it's handled and how the storage side of it is dealt with as well. And there's been some discussion about does electrification of transportation lead to a large increase in electricity demand, and that has been sort of a hope on the part of people in the nuclear industry anyway. I'm not so sure. It really depends on how it's managed in terms of storage and charging. Around electric vehicles, there's actually a lot of interest around treating them sort of as behind the meter assets, and not necessarily so that you know, the transactions around storage and energy use are happening effectively outside of the regulated part of the regime and on local smart energy networks. I mean, in Ontario, there's a great deal of attention being paid right now to the notion of community energy planning, which is about integrating distributed generation, treating vehicles as storage assets, particularly the batteries, as well as consumption assets, and integrating those into what are various described as smart energy networks and these kinds of things. And in effect, the regulator has sort of said it doesn't want to know about that. Anything that happens behind the meter, the Ontario Energy Board that universe does not exist. And yet that seems to be where a lot of the interesting stuff that's happening around that sort of question seems to be going to happen. That you'll have the local distribution utilities manage that internally, using renewable generating assets, solar, wind, as the energy source for vehicle charging, and then using the batteries as a storage medium for providing supply. So the only part the system sees is at the interface where the distribution system connects to the transmission system. That seems where a lot of the energy, intellectual energy, and indeed on-the-ground energy seems to be going at the moment, is how that play-out would happen. Then that assumes a somewhat initially smaller scale than the province had originally projected, but that just doesn't seem to be going to happen in terms of the large commercial scale deployment that Ontario had talked about at one point. I think this is still a relatively niche part of the system, but an area where a lot of very interesting things are starting to happen.
If I may add, electric cars definitely have a bright future. We should welcome ongoing initiatives, especially with Quebec being very supportive to deploy more cars on the market and to install the recharge station. It has to be part of a smart grid management. And there's softwares already in place to optimize that. So the recharge happen not during the highest peak of the day, but at times where it's more economical to recharge. So it has to be dynamic with the load and all the other part of the energy portfolio consumption.
Yes.
Hello, building on what is being said, actually, I'm not a specialist on that front, but Hydro-Quebec overall, we say it's a marginal impact. Because we won't have 1 million cars right away on the fleet market, and as well, 1 million VE would be equivalent to have 500 megawatt in consumption, and we have to look at it as well from the V2G perspective, like Monsieur Saint-Onge was saying. So it can go back to the grid as well. So it's not a big impact on the grid at the moment.
I'll take a question from the web. We had one person sending us a question, a more general question. Greenhouse gas emissions are a world problem as opposed to an Ontario-Quebec problem. Does enhanced Ontario-Quebec electricity trade address world greenhouse gas emissions, or does it simply shift Ontario-Quebec emissions problems to others? In other words, is Ontario a more effective user of Quebec's renewable resources? I don't know if one of the 4 panelists wants to answer that.
Well, just to be blunt, the CO2 has no boundaries, you know. So it's a worldwide problem, obviously, and you need to have a tangible impact. First off, and I come back to the recognition of what exists. I think now people take for granted that Idaho will stay in the respective jurisdiction, intermittent resources will stay there. There's movements between state and province of these type of assets. So the benefit need to be captured, and there's low-hanging fruit right now that states can tap on. But when it's going to be the case, then the next round will definitely need to be addressed with incremental impact on the market. So you do need to have system and agreements in place with tangible incremental impact indeed. So that benefit not only Quebec but the entire region to start with. So.
Gaëtan?
Well, I was going to say, this is a good economic question. And if one assumes that the price of electricity includes proper carbon pricing, the most effective user of the resource will be whomever wants to pay the most for it. And it could be neither Ontario or Quebec. It could be Americans who will pay more. And then, assuming again that the price of the carbon is included in the price of the commodity, the money will go where it should to optimize the global solution to climate change. So it's a good question, and I'd say the price signal, either through a cap and trade or carbon tax, is the right answer. So easy to say, so difficult to implement.
I mean, it's a function, too, of what's being displaced.
Yeah.
And partially the market of carbon price is a way of determining what's the most optimal thing to displace with the renewable resources. At the moment in Ontario, it would probably mostly be natural gas, but with the potential to sort of go further than the surface value precisely because of the balancing potential with wind as well. That if you can turn that into intermediate or baseload supply on a reliable basis, then you're displacing a lot of you're certainly displacing a lot of gas and potentially other things as well. You advance, the argument also becomes one of it's an advance of sustainability in terms of the adaptive capacity of the system as well as reducing carbon.
Yeah, if we can import, water power from Quebec at a reasonable price, that will be a very cost-effective greenhouse gas reduction strategy for Ontario. And so that's, important. We as a society have we have to have huge reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And in order to achieve those goals at a cost that is acceptable to consumers, we've got to focus on the lowest cost options to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. And certainly water power from Quebec would be a much lower cost option for Ontario than rebuilding nuclear reactors, which is the most expensive option to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Or preventing purchasing thermal generation elsewhere.
Right.
Or displacing existing ones.
Yeah.
Monsieur Odette.
Yes, Sylvain Odette, HEC Montreal. I'd like to hear the panel about who should bear the risk of building this entity. We're talking a lot about supply risk and demand risk. Well, who should take the risk and who should build these entities between Ontario and Quebec? Because there's always this question that's more down to earth, and I didn't hear anything from you about this.
Well, I can take a stab at that. We're proposing a deal that will be mutually beneficial for both provinces, and it would seem to me the logical solution would be for Hydro-Quebec to build the new transmission lines in the province of Quebec, and for Hydro One, our publicly owned electricity transmission company, to build the transmission lines in Ontario. That would be the most logical, natural first thing. Now, our friends at Brookfield, they're also in the transmission business. Maybe they'll say they can do it for a lower price. I don't know.
I will not pretend anything on that front. But I would say that it's either, there's a cost to deliver incremental energy. So either it's bundled with your energy and delivered as an all-in price, or it's priced separately. And if you want a different supplier, if you want to keep it open to different supplier to compete for that transmission, then you have to pay it to commit up front. Yeah. That's a debate going on right now in New England. So your question was actually pretty timely. In Ontario, there's already interties in place. There's no long-term contracts attached to it. So I don't think for Ontario it's a matter of interconnection capacity. There's a lot that can be done with the actual lines. In New England, in New York, it's another story, because the incremental cell will require new megawatts. And historically, as I mentioned in my presentation, most of the major lines have been built to support long-term contracts.
Yes, Gaëtan.
Just going back to my roots as a pseudo-market economist, the answer to your question is the risk is to be assumed by those willing to take it, with the expectation of return on investment, knowing that they could lose their shirt in the process. So if Hydro-Quebec wants to risk and bid lower than Brookfield, maybe Hydro-Quebec should get it. And then the shareholder will assume the consequences of a good move or a bad move on that. But it's well established in market economists that competition produces lower prices. Competition promotes innovation, technical and commercial. And I'd say, without talking about the political and historical and philosophical context, capacity between two provinces, if it is to be beefed up in the market economy, you request proposals for the transmission component unbundled and see who's the most audacious in terms of having a good price, a good financial health in terms of an entity that can actually bear the financial risk itself, and build it using competent resources. On natural gas, unbundling solved everything. You don't deal anymore. You know, who would want to improve the transmission of natural gas from point A to point B? The market decides every day. And if there is a carbon tax one day, natural gas will cost more than electricity on an equal basis. And the shifts will happen naturally through market forces.
In Quebec, there would need to be some regulatory changes because the transmission system is not yet as open as in other places.
That's right. See, in Ontario, the risk is low because the transmission system is already unbundled. And Hydro One runs it. A lot of the upgrades that would be needed on the Ontario side, the first phase, there's things that Hydro One is going to do anyway for reliability purposes in Eastern Ontario. So the risk is quite, I mean, ultimately it's borne by Ontario ratepayers because Hydro One would go to the Energy Board and ultimately ask to pass the cost through in the rate base, but it probably wouldn't do that unless there was a contract in place with Hydro-Quebec that would indicate that there would be a need for the capacity. So the risk, I think, on the Ontario side is really, it's very, very low, and the costs themselves are surprisingly modest, and the risks of overruns and delays are, you know, given Hydro One's record is very good, are probably extremely low. This is all existing corridors. It's upgrading existing corridors. It's pretty modest in terms of the risk.
So I think the risk linked with new transmission infrastructure are known, and the risk should be borne by the entities that, or the parties that is more capable of mitigating it. So obviously, Brookfield and any generator out of Quebec also definitely is willing to assume some risk. But again, it should be managed by the counterpart that is the most able to mitigate it. In New England, it's also a matter of what the consumer wants and how the risk appetite. Like the two models they're contemplating, it's either subsidizing a line and having a commitment to flow from generating resources. So that means you're going to pay for the line, but you don't know what price you will pay for the energy. If you're risk adverse and you want to secure a final delivered product, then you sign a PPA that includes the cost of that line in it. So the two models have merits. It's just a matter of what's the risk appetite of the end users.
We have one question here, and then we'll go on the other side. Please.
I have one question regarding the 500 megawatt swap between Quebec and Ontario. Since this morning, you speak about Hydro-Quebec as a single entity. For example, for balancing issues of intermittent wind energy in Ontario, it's quite obvious that it is the owner of the hydro production facility that will offer that service. But regarding the 500 megawatt swap, the entity that has a lack of capacity during the winter is the distributor, the regulated entity. So to your understanding, the 500 megawatt swap, the deal between Ontario and Quebec, should it involve the producer or the distributor?
That's a very good question, and I agree with your statement that the short situation is currently with the distributing affiliate, not the production arm of Hydro-Quebec. So I would guess that it would be Hydro-Quebec production that should be the primary supplier of that capacity. I mean, Brookfield, we have also merchant capacity that could contribute to the mix, not to the same scale, obviously. But so I think in Quebec it's a little bit clearer, but in Ontario it's more complicated because it's a competitive market, and it depends which resources will be dedicated to that contract. And the other problem is what's the frequency that they will call on the energy, because capacity, it's a call on energy at a specified price. So, and when they go on call the energy, it can be huge discrepancies between the time that they will call it and what will be the reciprocal consideration in that agreement. So I think there's some market rules that will need to be adjusted, and I'm just curious to see how it will evolve, and obviously if it creates an opportunity for us, Hydro-Quebec, to contribute, well, I think that's great for both markets.
Just to clarify, maybe for the audience, this deal is between it has been presented so far as a political agreement. It hasn't been written down as a contract between Hydro-Quebec production or distribution and an entity in Ontario. So it's been announced last November, I think, by the two premiers of the two provinces that they would swap 500 megawatt, but there hasn't been any details written down at this stage.
Yeah, at this stage, it's a joint memorandum, and the parties are Hydro-Quebec Marketing and the IESO in Ontario. Okay, as I understand, there's no actual contract. The statement of intent. Yeah.
Quebec Marketing is the entity that sell outside of the province for the Quebec production. So you have the same thing for the US, it's HQ US. Taking title at the border and selling into the market. So,
yes.
Good morning, and thank you to all the presenters and the organizers. My name is Franklin Gertler. I'm an attorney and a lawyer working in energy matters. And I hesitate to say this here in the halls of the HEC, but there's been a lot of talk today about sort of perfect information and perfect microeconomic rationality, it seems to me. And the last question started to get into the issues of how the institutional arrangements and the regulatory arrangements here in the province don't make all of this so easy because their political will is to take profits in some places and have control in other places and so forth. But so I'm wondering about your comments on those specific problems of a sort of lack of rationality, if you want, in what is done, especially here in Quebec. We don't have, and whether what you're talking about really will require integrated resource planning, which we briefly talked about and got rid of here in between 1996 and 2000, before it ever got off the ground. And the other issue is, I would put to you that any project of this nature, and I guess the CPR Railway and the St. Lawrence Seaway are two good examples, required some sort of vision of what the nature of the Canadian economic and political space is, and that, and maybe that's part of what's going wrong with Energy East, indeed, and so that what are the beyond the sort of rationality, what's the political and economic vision that needs to be put in place? Because the idea of east-west integration in these energy matters here in Quebec is not an easy sell, I don't think.
Anyone? Jack has already presented the rationale for Ontario.
Well, I think a broader vision is for Quebec and Ontario to cooperate in electricity and many other economic areas to once again be the economic powerhouses of Confederation, and which would be good for our economy and also to drive us towards a renewable future and to provide leadership in terms of dealing with the climate change issue. We've got a federal government that seems to be in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry, is not dealing with its climate change responsibilities, and I think this is great that the premiers of Ontario and Quebec seem to get along very well and are wanting to address a progressive agenda that will be good for the environment and the economy and for the country as a whole.
The risk, I mean, I think the positioning is for Ontario and Quebec, and indeed the way the premiers have positioned it has been as leaders in the transition to a low carbon economy, sort of the economy of the future. And I think in both provinces that's potentially a very appealing positioning. The trickier national vision part comes back to that works for BC, that works for Manitoba, it works maybe for a few other places. What do you do with the carbon provinces, and where do they fit into that national vision? And that part we haven't, partially because we've had a federal government. I mean, part of the reason Ontario and Quebec have entered into this conversation is because we have a federal government which has effectively given up on the role of attempting to broker compromises among the diverse energy interests of the different regions of the country. And so we've sort of taken it upon ourselves that there's an apparent commonality of interests between these two provinces at least, but it doesn't solve the problem of the larger national vision of what does this low carbon transition end up looking like. The idea theoretically is we're at least trying to think a few steps ahead in a carbon constrained world. Where do we want to be? And that at least is better than nothing. And Alberta and Saskatchewan and others will have to figure themselves out at some point.
I'd just like to agree with the assumption in the question about the fact that having a vision would be good. And I think the work of the premiers going on right now, of which the Ontario-Quebec thing, I would suspect is a kind of a subset, at least notionally, is a good thing. And the best expression of a vision in my mind would be the passing in the respective legislatures of laws that communicate that vision in terms of the institutional framework that will then be in effect, either as they are amended or reframed, to change, for instance, the mandate of the HEC Énergie or the Ontario Energy Board, all the moving parts in a democratic society. So I think legislatures and Canadian Parliament have found it helpful to make large-scale political visions available in the form of legislation and give to independent boards and agencies the role to implement that vision in all the details. So you're saying that right now in Quebec there are inefficiencies in the institutional framework? Well, I'd say it starts with the vision, and possibly by all the premiers of the provinces and territories, pass consistent legislation in the various jurisdictions that speak to each other in terms of what they achieve by way of amendments to legislation or new laws, and let competent people in independent boards do the rest of the work, the messy stuff that requires technical and economic and environmental choices.
I will add something. I think in Quebec, the main obstacle, which is actually in the law, is that it comes back to the 3 cents argument. People here worried about or mention the 3 cents exports to the US, but the fact is that most of power in Quebec is sold at 3 cents to Quebecers. Yeah. And people see that as a gift and an in-kind payment in terms of natural resources, where we can see that neighbors are willing to pay much more for that electricity than what the price we're asking to pay to Quebecers. And that's really, well, it's huge in Quebec. It's not unique to Quebec in the sense that Manitoba, British Columbia, and then many states and the federal US government has the same problem in terms of hydropower locked into some native load commitments to some specific users. And that has to be refought, and it's very hard to discuss. So I would say the main obstacle to free up that energy and to go to the user that would be actually the best one, the best users that willing to pay the best price, is that we have this long-term contract commitment to Quebecers to sell. It's called the bloc patrimonial, the heritage energy sold at 3 cents a kilowatt hour, and that we need to change that. It's very difficult politically. Quebecers have a hard time understanding that being paid in money is better than being paid in kind for that energy. When Quebecers will realize that it's better for the government to actually take the profit in terms of dollars and redistribute it to Quebecers instead of redistributing electricity to high-income households that are heating their basements, then that the society will make a move, and then Quebec will be better able to contribute to climate change goals more regionally. Yes.
Hi, JP Finney. I read recently that electricity politics in Ontario are equivalent to language politics in Quebec. I don't know if it's that bad. But I have a question for Jack particularly. Jack, you mentioned that this deal would be good economically for Ontarians, and I believe so. But what would you say to naysayers in Quebec that would say that such a deal would basically export jobs to Ontario?
Well, I don't think it would export jobs to Ontario. You're exporting the power at 3 cents. You're going to have an extra $700 million a year or $14 billion over 20 years. That's money that Quebec can invest in schools or hospitals or whatever you want to do, and potentially lower taxes in Quebec if you want to. So I think you can use the money to make the people of Quebec better off. And I don't think people are going to, industries are going to move from Quebec to Ontario to get lower electricity prices. Even if we do this deal, it will reduce Ontario's electricity rates. But our electricity rates, I guarantee you, will still be way, way higher than those of Quebec. Quebec has the lowest electricity rates in North America. Our electricity rates in Toronto are double those of Montreal. So, I mean, I can guarantee you, if we do this deal, it will help reduce our rates, but still, Quebec's electricity rates will be much, much lower than Ontario's electricity rates. So if there's industries that are very electricity intensive and are therefore attracted to have to do business in Quebec, they're going to stay in Quebec. They're not going to move to Ontario because of this deal.
Okay. Well, I don't think you'll get aluminum plants in Ontario soon because of that deal, but just the fact that the government has been under a lot of criticism about Ontario businesses leaving because of too high electricity rates, to me just tells me that if you got an opportunity to get cheaper rates, for sure it would boost your economy, and it would help you.
Well, sure, it's going to boost our economy, absolutely. But we're all in the same country, and if Ontario's richer, that's going to be also good for you. And yeah, our high electricity rates are maybe driving jobs out of Ontario, but we've got we had a great automobile industry in Ontario. I mean, Quebec doesn't. I mean, I don't see that we're competing. I mean, we want lower rates for our manufacturing industries, but we're competing with the U.S. So I think what makes Ontario richer will also help make Quebec richer, and I don't think this is a zero-sum game. I think we can both be better off by doing a mutually beneficial electricity deal.
I mean, rates in Ontario would, as Jack says, are still going to increase for a variety of reasons. They'll increase less than they otherwise would. And remember, in Ontario, it's more a question of retaining what manufacturing remains. I mean, I doubt anybody would move from Quebec to Ontario. Because as Jack says, the price advantage, at least on the electricity, and electricity is still, except for certain very specific sectors, not the overriding variable in terms of locational decisions. There's other factors which have been driving what's been happening to manufacturing and resource processing in the Ontario economy. So I think the risk for Quebec is extremely low of that particular problem. I mean, in both jurisdictions, I mean, in Ontario, the decline of energy-intensive activities is structural anyway. So it's highly unlikely you would attract any new industry that's that sensitive to electricity is still going to end up in Quebec, I think.
Gaëtan?
Just, you either believe in free markets or you don't, or you believe in free trade or not. And it's very difficult, as Pierre-Olivier illustrated with the 3-cent thing, to communicate that to Quebecers and Ontarians and Canadians and North Americans. But it is well established that if you remove trade barriers, if you remove market inefficiencies, you make everybody a little richer. And when you cause transition difficulties with a sector of the economy being a sector which is not competitive, say, with the advent of trade liberalization, then you've got social programs to deal with the transition issues that come with that. So yes, the naysayers could say there will be some sectors of the Quebec economy that could be affected negatively if Ontario is more prosperous. But as someone has already said, then some Quebec suppliers will do better business in Ontario as a result, but the net gain is positive, inevitably, unless you believe that 5-year planning is better. And then few people nowadays believe that 5-year planning by bureaucrats would produce superior economic outcomes. So if you believe, then I think the difficulty for this group here this morning, and I think for policymakers, for politicians whose job it is to get elected and then re-elected, how do you communicate something like that that markets will provide a public interest better than micromanagement of economic forces, subject, and that's where we often fail, subject to proper regulation of the safety and environmental and monopolistic phenomena that happen in any imperfect world like ours. So I'd say communicate as convincingly as you can the advantages of letting market forces address economic issues and environmental issues like climate change, task regulators to keep people safe and protect the environment, and then let the markets do its things. And when you have some unfortunate casualties of liberalization of trade, you've got social programs of at least of a transitionary nature to deal with that effectively. Again, easier said than done.
Yes, and then we'll move to a question there.
Hello again. I guess this is a panel on electricity, so, food for thought. I guess that for integrating West and East in Canada, we could have, I think, a great discussion about natural gas instead of petroleum, which seems like President Obama said in his last State of Union speech to be a bridge to the future in terms of energy. Well, food for thought, so I'm going to ask my question about electricity now. In terms of RECs, I've heard Mr. Saint-Onge talk about it, and in Quebec, this discussion is totally absent. We don't talk about it. Mm-hmm. We don't talk about this money we could get with all these class 1, these 3,300 megawatt of wind. We could get, some RECs out of it. And I've never known, and it's very difficult to get a clear answer, but I'd like to hear the panel on what are the economic outlooks of if we had the interconnection, if we were able, let's say, to bring this wind energy to the exportation market, how much would we get? How would it work? Which state would take it? Just give us some down-to-earth figures or numbers or ideas here, because quite frankly, my impression is that there's a lot of money on the table, and everyone focused on the price per megawatt hour number without talking about that money that's right there on the other side of the border.
Yeah. It's a very good question, actually. And when you look at project, you always need to look at the depreciation impact you'll have on the market. Obviously, if you build thousands of megawatts, you flood the market with incremental generation that qualifies as high category RECs, the price will dive pretty fast, So that's why you have to be careful of not killing the goose, So, and so it's very difficult to have a clear view, obviously, because first of the discrepancies between the RPS program in the States, the targets that evolve, the legislative action to modify these targets, But obviously, if you look at the incremental green generation being supplied in the new jurisdiction, you should get compensated, and you should have an argument to have the full value being paid to you. If it's $10 or if it's $60, if it's a per MMBTU impact, you should definitely be recognized, and these recognitions should be consistent from one state to the other. So very difficult to answer, with hard figures, and we have long-term views on different categories of RECs. But who knows how it will evolve, and time will tell. So.
We'll take a last question because it's almost already noon. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the roundtable this morning. To what extent do you think that these negotiations about electricity trade have been connected to capacity planning of electric power systems? In the sense, for example, that a price could be, for example, a function of quantity and of a function of the type of contract, instead of just a fixed price in general without considering the volume of the trade.
Well, if you're referring to the MOU for the 500 megawatt, it's a MOU, so we still need to learn all the details, and it's not a huge quantity to have a significant impact in both markets, but it's a good starting point. You have to, if it's a first, and that will generate more larger size opportunity like that, then you're right. it will absolutely need to be included in any planning exercise by both jurisdictions.
Yes, but if we consider, for example, the substitution of nuclear power plants, in that case, perhaps it would be a high volume.
Yeah.
But probably the price will depend on the quantity of or volume of trade.
You wanna?
Yeah, I mean, I think for high volume, what Ontario would probably be looking for, is a fixed price. At the moment, the more contingent exchanges that happen basically on the basis of what goes on in the wholesale market in Ontario, as the IESO needs to either dump because it's got surplus baseload generation. Indeed, we've had moments when we've paid negative prices. We've paid people to take electricity off our hands, or it's also paid very high prices when demand has been very high. In terms of overall planning, given that in Ontario, we don't have any planning process anymore, at least not a public one, it's a good question about how all of this will come together. Effectively, that's happening inside the black box of the now merged OPA and IESO. And one of the ongoing concerns is the lack of any public dimension to that. Many people have asked, that, for example, we should be having a conversation in front of the Ontario Energy Board about the cost effectiveness of an arrangement with Quebec versus committing irrevocably to the refurbishment of nuclear power plants. Something that's never happened in Ontario, and yet that's not happening. There is no regulatory or public dimension to these conversations at the moment. I don't know if that answers your question, though.
Yes,
I think you're on a different track.
If I may add, what would influence the price? It's the characteristic of the product that you're buying. If it's a firm delivery, a non-firm delivery, if it's recallable, so all these factors will influence the pricing a lot.
Yes. But just to finish, but in that case, if you don't have a planning of the power system, how can you ensure the adequacy of the power system? The adequacy, I mean that you can supply the demand at all times.
Well, in Ontario, ultimately it comes down to, in theory, that was the original theory that underlay the marketization of the Ontario electricity system in the 1990s, was that you would have a wholesale market and that people would bid in supply to the market until you had met demand. And the price, which was on a 5-minute ahead schedule, just kept going up and up and up. During critical summer peaks, until finally enough people responded that you were able to meet demand. We had a few moments when it almost didn't get there. That was essentially the problem, though, is that the lack of anybody doing any longer-term planning than 5 minutes ahead was seen by particularly by the large industrial consumers, and I think by everybody else too, as potentially very problematic, particularly in a situation where 80% of your generating assets are facing end of life over the 20-year period ahead of you. A lot of people began asking questions about, what's the plan to keep the lights on here? And that is effectively how we move back into what's now a planning regime where the public agency, the Ontario Power Authority, does the planning and then contracts the supply from private providers like Brookfield and others. That's essentially the model we've ended up with. So that's, the OPA in Ontario does the long-term piece, and the IESO, the market operator, now the grid operator, deals with the sort of 5-minute ahead situation as to how do you keep up with demand on a dynamic basis, on a sort of moment-to-moment basis. And ultimately, that does come back to the wholesale market. They say we need dispatchable supply to supply in the next 5 minutes, and they see who bids in until they get to what they need.
Thank you very much. I'd like at this point to thank everyone for joining the conversation and the 4 panelists to come here and enlighten us with their presentations. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank again the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada for supporting this event. I'd like also to mention and thank deeply Joanne Whitmore, who organized with the chair and was the person. Thank you very much. Without her, we wouldn't be here today. Everything will be again on the live, not live, but on the web. So if you want to listen again, if you want to spread the word, to share these thoughts to other people, the conversation will continue. Eventually, we'll also do a white paper on these issues. And again, thank you for joining the conversation today. And lunch is there, so we can continue to have informal discussions. The panelists will stay here. Lunch is at the same place where you took coffee, so you are all invited for lunch right now. Thank you again.